Hi, I'm Greg Schaefer, and welcome to Conversation 201 here on the virtual CISO moment. Today we have Thomas Ritter. He is an attorney and co-owner at Ritter Gallagher. Thomas, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me, Greg. If you're not ready to fight cyber criminals after that intro music, then you're in the wrong profession.
It gets the blood boiling. I love it. It's like, some people, they see the guitar behind me over my shoulder here, and they're like, wow, did you play that? I'm like, oh, come on. No, I'm not that good. I can barely do three chords. And, it's like, even then, it's like just open chords, bar chords, I have a serious problem with, but I'm working on it. But anyway, happy to have you here. And this is almost like a bookend episode because we had your partner, Ryan, on here. It's been like over a year now, I think. So, love to hear about your path, your story, and your firm and what it is you're doing. Because this is a little bit different from most folks that we have here on the virtual CISO moment. We don't focus as much as we should on the law and legal side of both security and privacy. So tell us your story.
Sure, yeah, thanks. So, Nashville native, grew up here in Middle Tennessee and went to the University of Tennessee for undergrad as well as law school. It was actually in my last year of law school that I was first exposed to the concept of really the law around privacy and security. And I took a elective course kind of as an afterthought with a very notable professor at Tennessee who is an antitrust guy and really renowned. And he taught this course that I and two other students were in. We met twice a week in his office. And that was really
That's
my
a small
first.
class for sure.
There was no hiding in this class, suffice to say. But that was my first exposure to really thinking about, the law and policy around privacy and security. And mind you, this was back in, 2014, 2015, and the law in this space is really nascent, right? I mean, if you think about just data breach notification statutes, the first one was California. I want to say it was around 2007, 2008. So these laws around privacy and security really haven't been around for more than the last 15 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
So it was this course that really captured my interest. I graduated, got out, immediately started practicing with a mid-sized firm, primarily doing regulatory work. But I had just an incredible boss that pushed me to kind of go into an area and field that was of real interest and passion to me, and I could never really get privacy and security out of my brain. And then 2 years into my career, Cambridge Analytica happened, right?
Mm.
And for many people, myself, included, I think that was a real wake up in terms of just like data aggregation and how companies were, collecting data points on people and the things that they were doing with it. And obviously there was huge regulatory fallout and investigations from that. And so that kind of made me take the proverbial plunge into wanting to pursue this area of practice, if you will. And I shifted my focus from more broader regulatory work into privacy and security work around 2017, 2018. And then in the ensuing years, I just basically jumped from bigger firm to bigger firm, just solely operating in that space as a privacy and security practitioner, leading up to and into this past year when I guess Ryan and I and our firm has been open just over a year now, which is hard to believe. And that's all we do. We live, eat, sleep, breathe, privacy and security. And we love to work with, companies both proactively as well as reactively to try to equip them as best as possible to handle the everyday rigors that come with, being a target in the security space and really needing to understand the types of information that they're in possession of and, the privacy protections they should have in place.
I can't. It's hard for me to believe it. I know this is such an old guy thing to say. It's like, but I can't believe it's already been a year since you guys founded it. Because I remember when that happened, and it was like, oh, this is cool, and you were filling a gap that I think is still huge. Because I think we have a. This is just my opinion. But in information security, and I prefer to use the term information security as opposed to just as to cybersecurity, just because to connotate the idea of like a broader umbrella. But I mean, people can use the term interchangeably. It's either, whichever one floats your boat. But sometimes I think those of us who are practitioners, we get into this comfort zone where we say, we've done a gap assessment, we've done a risk assessment, and we've gotten an audit, a third party audit on pick your framework or compliance. Let's just say PCI, just because that's the first one that came to my mind. And that gives us, no pun intended, I think, a false sense of security. But from a legal perspective, because we've got this certification and we've been audited, that doesn't totally remove our liability if something goes wrong, does it? And if it doesn't, what are we talking about as far as liability that's still there?
Yeah, it's a great question, Greg. I mean, for one thing, when you're talking about, audits, pen tests, vulnerability assessments, the crux of the matter is, usually a business is identifying pain points, right, and weaknesses in their security architecture. And from a legal perspective, the issue with that is, what do you then move forward and do with those findings? And unfortunately, far too often we've seen, past clients that haven't always remediated some of those insufficiencies. And the problem therein lies with if they do have a security incident, right? And that incident, rises to the level of a reportable breach, then the question that, plaintiffs' attorneys, regulators are going to be asking is, what did you know and when did you know it, right? And what did you do about it? And as a microcosm of that, you're really seeing that these past few years in data breach class action lawsuits, right? Plaintiffs' attorneys have very quickly become adept at asking for some of the things we just mentioned, right? Pen test findings, vulnerability assessments, because they're wanting to drill down on, a company having cognizance and awareness over, there being some real insufficiencies within their environment, and then unfortunately, not doing anything to correct those insufficiencies. So I think a long-winded way to say, it's important to involve legal folks because our jobs in a nutshell are really to serve as risk mitigators when it comes to information security. And we want to help businesses see around the corner and really layer on top of information security this idea of legal risk and how those interplay with each other.
Yeah, I know from a security standpoint, I'm a frequent proponent of saying that the primary or a primary duty, if you will, role of the chief information security officer or even the VCISO, the part-time, the fractional, whatever you want to call them, that they have to provide as much information about the environment, the threat environment, the controls in the environment from an information security protection standpoint so that the board and the C-suite can make risk-informed decisions. And sometimes I kind of leave it right there. And I realize that that's not completely where I should, because you just brought up a very good point that I think a lot of us as practitioners in this space don't consider. It's just, we can say, okay, here's the risk from our perspective. But remember, if there's a breach, there's still a huge legal risk. And to your point, we need to have legal involved with regards to this risk evaluation as well, too, correct?
I mean, unequivocally so, yeah. And, legal is able to really frame, if you will, or actualize that risk with the help of a CISO, a CIO, right? And you're able to kind of put a box around and parameters around, the measures that are being undertaken, some of the costs associated with those measures, and then the fallout if those measures, don't meet a sufficient level, right? Or say those measures are inadequate to the level of, negligence. I think what's really interesting, and I've spoken at length about this on a number of different platforms, much like your own, is in the last few years, we're repeatedly seeing very high profile breaches emanate out of the most basic of security measures, right? And it's one of those things where, I mean, everyone's fatigued at this point to see that the attack vector once again is a lack of MFA
Yeah, I
being
mean,
deployed throughout the environment.
it's 2025. I mean, come on, everybody.
Yeah. So I think, that speaks though to, and I know you have a particular emphasis and focus on small and mid-sized businesses, that aligns rather nicely with a lot of our clientele. And on initial scoping calls, we usually say, don't get sucked into or become a victim of paralysis by analysis, right? I think most small to mid-sized businesses look at security and they say, we don't have a huge budget. We don't have a huge team of, security engineers. Like, where do we start? And using, the example I just gave about, repeated deficiencies that you see in massive companies that get breached who have, 7-figure security budgets, it's start with the basics, right? Start with, basic cyber level hygiene. Make sure MFA is deployed throughout the environment, have strong passwords, make sure you're updating your operating system,
I mean, I
as
just
often
did
as you
right
can.
before recording this, and it's like we almost didn't record this because Windows updates. Yes, I still use Windows. It was dragging and dragging and dragging, and then finally we got it all done. But it's an important thing to do. It's important to make sure that we do keep this all updated. So good advice there. Let me just draw that out a little bit more, specifically for small and mid-sized businesses. Of course, all businesses should be doing the basics, and that's going to take care of most of the items out there. But from what you've seen, and a relatively unique perspective here on this podcast is, what do you feel are today the most significant threats that small and mid-sized businesses face? Is it just simply that they're not doing the basics, or are there other items as well?
I think not doing the basics plays right into the hands of cyber criminals. And a common misperception that we see from clients and just, general businesses within the marketplace is this idea that we're not attractive enough to these cyber criminals. And that's not the way that these bad actors think.
No.
Their whole methodology is to cast a wide net and see, what sort of fish they bring in. And they're not immediately all that concerned with if it's a small or mid-size or really large catch, right? They think strictly through the lens of financial opportunity. And so, unfortunately, we've had a number of small to mid-sized businesses over the years that have been victims of really nasty ransomware attacks. And that's one of the things we hear from them in the immediate aftermath is, I would have never thought that we would have been a target for these bad actors. And again, it's just very rarely do these, criminal organizations think and specifically tailor, their attack methodology to fit a particular profile. They're just wanting, to go check doors and see which is unlocked. And once they find an unlocked door and they're in, it then immediately becomes about how can I quickly get paid. So ransomware is always a big one. I think wire fraud is another one that never ceases to amaze me. Is just the proliferation of wire fraud doesn't seem to be slowing down, and we get calls all the time, unfortunately, well after the fact, from businesses that are on one end or the other of a wire transfer that's gone bad because a bad guy's misdirected the funds. So those are probably the two that we deal with early and often.
Yeah, the idea of like I'm too small has been out there for so long, and I've never found a way to quite get over that. Kim Commando says that the way to get over that is when you get backup religion, for example. She's been saying that for years, not in response to necessarily a cyber attack, but if you lose like your data because of some issue. And what she's really saying is that don't wait until something bad happens to you to understand this. And even now, I would argue, and feel free to push back, but I would argue that the threat environment to small and mid-sized businesses is actually greater nowadays because the larger organizations, they do have the resources, they do have the tools in place, they have the folks to monitor. But the smaller folks, they really don't. They rely upon different services, or sometimes when you get even to the small startups, there's such a propensity to want to um, take on higher risk just in order to get a product out the door. And so then they become like a larger target. And certainly one of those attacks can just kill a small business, right?
I mean, I couldn't agree more with you. The immediate thing that came to mind was I had a client a number of years ago that small real estate type business, family owned and operated. They became the victim of a ransomware. They had one external IT professional that had been working with them for, a decade plus. And unfortunately, it was just one misstep after the other in the first, 3 to 5 days of the ransomware attack kicking off. And it put them out of business. They lost all of their records. They didn't have the means to be able to pay the ransom demand. Legally, our fees, started to accrue very quickly, and they couldn't survive it. Within 6 months from the date of the initial attack, they went out of business, unfortunately. And so that's just one kind of symbolic example of exactly what you speak of. And the analogy I often use is, right, oftentimes people don't know they need to go see the doctor until it's well after the fact, right? And they're exhibiting a lot of, troubling symptoms. And
yeah, I'm kind of like that.
we all are in a way. I think like that. I'm like that. But that same adage can kind of prove to be true for businesses and how they approach information security. And if you wait until something bad happens, the pain is just going to be exponentially greater than if you do at least some of something, right, proactively on the front end. And so that's Ryan and I feel like our greatest, work and ability to help people is when we have the opportunity to get in on the front end. And really, I used the phrase earlier, mitigate risk, but, help them see around the corners prior to having something bad happen and go wrong. So, there's steps that small and mid-sized businesses can take, and it's not just the basic security controls, but it's how are you thinking about, cyber insurance, and do you have coverage, and do you know what that policy says? Do you know how to invoke coverage if you need to? It's some of those things that we really enjoy helping clients walk through.
So we mentioned about not only like the security person being involved with providing the information to the executive leadership board of directors to have them be able to make risk-informed decisions. We said that we should get legal involved as well too. What are your feelings about getting like finance, CFO involved? Because you're talking about like now a big financial risk if something bad happens. Do you see that in businesses where the risk is evaluated at least in part by the finance executive of the organization?
We absolutely do, particularly with respect to cyber insurance and trying to, have a sound understanding for, what it is the organization does, their risk profile. That calculus is different for every business, right? And someone being down 2 or 3 days is potentially manageable, right? Being inoperable for some businesses for a matter of a few days, they can withstand, whereas others cannot, like the example I gave earlier. So yeah, I mean, I think CFOs should and often are a part of these type conversations, particularly around trying to assess, InfoSec risk. And when we talk about insurance and are you insured for enough, should you have, a cyber incident occur, they're usually involved in those conversations and providing us the necessary information to allow us to kind of give our 2 cents on making allowing them to make an informed decision.
Yeah, that's another one of those instances where if a business has the attitude of like, I just want to get through all this security mumbo jumbo stuff and just continue with my business, they need to understand that continuing with the business means you have to pay due diligence to these sorts of conversations. It's very important to do that. But I want to get back to one other thing. Let me get back to the practitioner for a second before moving on, because I have to ask this. It's like, well, I'll just come out and say it. You guys should write a book. You guys should write a book for us senior level practitioners about these are the legal considerations that a basic CISO, a security and a privacy officer should consider beyond like the ones that you would consider to be obvious. Because I don't know, maybe there is a book out there right now, but do you know of any resources or that maybe something that you guys do that can help like schmucks like me?
You know, we do routinely do kind of one-off, brainstorming sessions with security professionals. We'll touch on, potential individual liability, which in and of itself can be a whole another conversation in lieu of recent years. But then we talk about, how they can advocate to the board for there to be board and executive leadership involvement. I think for publicly traded companies and the recent amendments in the last few years to the cybersecurity rules that, the SEC promulgated, they're now forcing that issue, right? But for small to mid-sized businesses, there needs to be stakeholder engagement and involvement really across the executive leadership when it comes to cyber. And no, that isn't me trying to say that executives need to know the integral measures that are being performed throughout the environment and the type of security controls that are in place, but they need to be briefed on the way things should go and how things should be done in a legally compliant manner should an incident arise. And far too often we see companies just completely and wholly unprepared for that sort of thing and how it happens. So you're kind to say we should write a book. I would say that, Ryan and I, as many, incidents as we've kind of ridden shotgun and with clients over the years, we've got a litany of, stories that
you've got the material,
just which are very interesting.
Anonymize it and put it in a book and put it out there and maybe sell like a gazillion copies and at the very least promote your business. But I all this stuff is very. I've been doing IT, cybersecurity, information security. I've been in this field for a long time, and I've never known a time, whether it be on the IT side of ensuring that we have our services up and running 24/7 by 365, and that there's no latency in the network, all the way to, well, do we have the best security controls in place from a cyber perspective? Do we have proper governance and risk management in place from an information security perspective? I get stressed out, and sometimes I want to take on the world. I want to do everything. I want everything to be perfectly secure, and there is no such thing. And when you can't marry those two things together, your wants and reality, it can be stressful. And sometimes we internalize the stress and too much, and we need to deal with it in an external way, in a healthy way. And what's one of the things that you do to deal with stress, not only of being in our field, but also being a small business owner yourself?
Yeah, I love this question. And I'll add, being a father of two small children as well, right? Who I love dearly, but, oftentimes don't just keep me on my toes, but wake me up very early in the morning. For me, a great source of de-stress is just exercise. I'm a runner. I mentioned earlier, I grew up in Nashville, and we have such a luxury of having so many beautiful, well-maintained parks around the city. And so I frequent them often. I'm constantly running over in Percy and Edwin Warner, the parks. And so, I really can't emphasize enough the importance of of people taking care of themselves, particularly in our field. I myself, at various times over the course of my career, have been, the subject of just major burnout and fatigue. And we operate in a very high stress, high intense environment, just by what we do. And, I'll speak for you, Greg. I know you love what you do. I love what I do. But with that, comes many challenges that are oftentimes very unique just to the nature of our field. So for me, it's exercise. I'm a big reader. And then I also love just film. I'm a frequent goer of, movies and watching, good shows on television. So those are kind of my bucket of things that help me de-stress.
Have you checked out any of the trail runs in Smith Park in Brentwood?
I have not.
Because and I don't usually get up to Nashville that often. Of course, everybody else who's listening to this who's outside of Middle Tennessee doesn't care about this stuff, but I don't care. I like talking about it. But the Smith Park is not too far from where I live, and they've got some decent rocky trail runs there. One that is a great climb too, the Red Trail. For me, I'm obviously just about 2 or 3 years older than you, so I'm a lot slower. But I do find that it's a good workout, and I agree. And actually, the what they call the Rock and Roll Marathon in Nashville.
Yep.
Originally, it was Country Music Marathon. I believe the first year was 2000. It was either 99, 2000. I think it was 2000, and that was my first marathon. So
okay, yeah, I've been a participant in it a couple different times.
That's a hilly course, man.
It is. It really is.
And then you came up. I think it's Robertson Parkway, whatever it is. The parkway around the courthouse is around mile 16, depending upon what version of the course. And that wall, 16. No, that's probably about 18 at that point in time. And then you get to see Nissan Stadium where the finish line is, and you jog right past it for another 6 miles.
I know. Yeah. It's like a carrot dangling, in front of you that they then rip away. Yeah.
That is just cruel. Well, outside of running, what future plans do you have?
For us, I think professionally, we want to continue to grow our firm, and Ryan and I, have some real ambitions to increase in size, but we also just continue to, have a vested interest in being members of this community. And so we're involved in various organizations. We're members of the ISSA Middle Tennessee chapter. I have in past years served on the board. We've got a couple other things in the pipeline in terms of just kind of civic engagement that we're really passionate about doing, particularly if we can kind of involve our expertise and find ways to, give back and allow, people within these communities, our time and services free of charge. Ryan and I are big believers in that. So yeah, I think short term, just continuing to do good work for our clients, long term, wanting to grow this thing into a bigger firm, but a firm that feels, relatable and that is a vested member of the Middle Tennessee community and that's still very approachable for clients of all sizes.
Awesome, man. Well, I love your guys' enthusiasm. I love the mission that you're doing, love the work that you're doing, and also helping to educate us all in the security field. And I appreciate you spending your time this morning with us just to chat about some very interesting stuff. I could go on for another hour and a half, but unfortunately, we don't have the time.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to come on, Greg. I know this has been, many, many months in the planning. So.
Well, I do tend to book. I mean, at one point in time, I was booked a year in advance, and now I'm down to about 4.5, 5 months. So I appreciate you being patient and waiting. So it's well worth it.
I agree. Thanks for having me on.
All right, and everybody, stay secure.